hounds, chase ghosts, come sleep, watch out, demons are coming, run, sleep, hide, spirits, ghosts, hide, demons, hounds, ghosts, demons are coming, spirits, ghosts.
Hello, my little hellhounds. Welcome to Home of Scares. If you like the chills running down your spine and to be scared, fueled with anxiety, then join us twice a week on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And don't forget to increase your anxiety levels. Just make sure you subscribe. Sleep tight, my hellhounds. Well, my little hellhounds, tonight we have a bunch of fictional stories posted to our subreddit r/homeofscares. They have been submitted by Black Cat 1206. Let's begin. She remains. When the plague breaks out, Annie is one of the first to succumb to it. She is already frail and ill due to the utter poverty and degradation her and hers have been forced to live in. As she becomes sicker, the village is closed off from the rest of the community. There is wild talk about the purifiers who roam condemned villages and enter the homes of possible carriers of the sickness to drag them away to cure and cleanse the community. People are too afraid to speak of the cure, which these organized vigilante thugs carry out on the poor, unfortunate sick. But just recently there have been rumors of several mysterious, huge pyres appearing just on the outskirts of the cut-off village, and an unnatural sweet arid smoke has scorched the jet black sky right through to dawn every night of the last month. The rest of Annie's family can't bear to be parted from their beloved grandmother, so not having any other option, they make her as comfortable as they can in the cellar where they keep their meagre stores. At least they can care for her and have her close. One thing the family has overlooked is the altruistic act of love is the rapid infection rate of the sickness in enclosed spaces, and as the rest of Annie's family slips one by one into the sickness's deadly clutches, Annie can't do anything but sit slumped in her favourite rocking chair, screaming silent, painful screams of anguish as she hears the door being forced and the strangely inhumane voices of the purifiers as they drag or carry Annie's precious family out of the modest but once warm and cosy little cottage to be cured. She hears the shrill cries of the baby, the mournful sobs of the children, and the desperate pleas of her daughter and son-in-law, and she is unable to do nothing but sit slumped in her favourite rocking chair, screaming silent, painful screams of anguish. She remains. Witch's Willow. This is a fictional tale inspired by, but not about, my own family's beliefs and roots from generations back. Once upon a time, long ago, there lived a young woman in a small village, the region of where exactly is long forgotten, but the name was Willow Way. Willow Way was the home of 150 souls and was a very proper, clean, tidy, upstanding little village whose people were wholesome, law-abiding citizens who went to church every Sunday and were always ready to help anyone. The young woman's name was Bessie Martin, and she was what the villagers called a child of nature, and they were all very wary and suspicious of her, which surprised and quite upset Bessie, as she did not think there was anything outlandish or odd about her lifestyle or habits. After all, she merely prepared and brewed natural remedies to treat and cure minor ailments with herbs, flowers and plants, and baked bread and other baked goods to earn a modest, decent living, as her grandmother did before her. When Bessie was 3, her mother died from a lung disease, so Bessie went to live with her grandmother, and as she got older, helped with her grandmother's tiny home bakery business. Bessie grew up to be a good, true, honest girl who was as beautiful as she was kind, and by the time her grandmother passed away when Bessie was 21, she had quite a lot of admirers. The mayor of Willow Way had a handsome young son who, at the time of this story, was 25. His name was Roderick. He was very tall, strong, and, with a group of his friends, liked nothing more than to go out and about the area, spending their money drinking and fighting with the local youths of the community. Nothing ever happened to Roderick or his friends. Money can pay off injuries and damages and buy freedom. Roderick had a long-term understanding he was betrothed to the village's squire's lovely daughter, May. She was pretty, 18, and educated in the ways of a lady of high status. Now, the story told is that one day, when Bessie Martin was by the stream, she had been spending a much-deserved morning off from baking to enjoy the warm spring sunshine, and after paddling her small, dainty feet in the cool, calming water, she decided to rest up against the big old willow tree. Suddenly she saw Roderick, or Roderick saw her. They did know of each other's existence. Roderick was taken by her assured confidence, her wild yet gentle beauty, and her pure, kind soul, which was one thing that his betrothed May did not possess. For Bessie's part, she was intrigued by him in his boisterous and wayward behaviour, fascinated by his entire presence, and flattered by his attention to her femininity. What happened next does not need to be mentioned. It can be imagined. Needless to say, it began with, "Hello, fair maiden." Promises spoken that could not be kept, not even by the most honourable of men, and we know Roderick was not at all honourable. It finished with a heavy, swollen belly and bitter tears of loneliness. Roderick and May were married in the autumn, after Roderick's secret liaison with Bessie ended so bitterly, and the heated longing he had once felt for his bonny wildflower soon cooled and faded altogether, to be replaced by the constant, adoring love for his fresh young bride. A year passed. Bessie had her child, a fair and delicate infant that she named Lily, in the same little cottage that she grew in, and for many months Bessie and her baby lived a happy, peaceful, carefree life. Roderick's decaying, blue, bloated body was discovered by the stream he first saw and started to woo Bessie Martin. The cause of his too early demise was unclear to the village chirurgeon, but soon uncomfortable and ugly whispers began to ripple through the small, close-knit, highly religious community of Willow Way. The whispers suggested that Roderick's death was not a natural one, nor not quite murder either. The whispers, insidious and filled with untamed spite, spoke of taboo and unholy acts committed by godless and wanton creatures. One creature in particular was the subject of these unfounded suspicions. These suspicions were not new, merely old ones given more fuel by fresh and undeniable evidence of wrongdoing. The whispers were of Bessie Martin, and the source of the whispers, perhaps quite understandably, May. The first thing Bessie knew of the angry mob was when they used brute force to break down the little wooden door and dragged Bessie out of her meagre bed by her hair. Another member of the mob plucked the terrified babe Lily from the cozy warm cot and followed the leader out of the small dwelling, where he, the mayor of the good, upstanding Willow Way, in turn put his lighted torch to the modest cottage. The kindling blazed throughout the deep, dark night. The vengeful mob brought Bessie Martin to her beloved Willow. They strung her up to the tree by her neck. They watched until the last flicker of life left her twitching, tortured body. When the corpse of Bessie Martin swung limply to and fro, the mayor of Willow Way coldly placed the fragile infant Lily into the hollow of the willow, turned away and commanded the mob to leave. Before she relinquished her precious life to the pitiful wails of her cherished child, she looked over upon the still tranquil stream where her lost love had made so many breakable promises to her, and in turn had paid for his indiscretions in a watery grave. Cold, steely hatred of everything and everyone who had forsaken her and her innocent Lily filled up her eyes, replacing the tears of sorrow, and with it came the hex. The hex was as dark as the night around her. It had formed. She succumbed. Bessie Martin was 23 when she died. Lily Martin was 8 months when she died. A month after the fateful night, a youth from a neighbouring village came forward to confess that he was present on the day Roderick died. They had fought, and Roderick lost his footing and fell, banging his head against a rock on the bank of the stream. Roderick had fallen into the water. The youth, fearful that he would be accused of murder, panicked and fled. However, his conscience laid heavy on him, and he soon felt obliged to come forward and tell his tale. Nothing happened. Well, what could happen? The angry mob had already exacted their gruesome and terrible revenge. After acting as judge, jury, and executioner. A few weeks after the unfortunate youth's confession, the mayor of Willow Way was found dead near the willow. The village churgan of the yet unknowing darned little village found death was caused by a bullet to the heart, probably a lethal hunting accident, although no other living person was found near the area, and the bullet indeed came from the mayor's own gun. A few months after the mayor's death, May, the newly bereft young widow of Roderick, was found by a housemaid, face down in the stream. Talk was that she had been a shadow of her former self, since her husband's untimely passing, and unable to fend off the dark, sinister shadow of grief, she had chosen to join her groom. Others believed that a more ominous supernatural hand had guided and overseen the two sad tragedies. They kept their notions to themselves. It is said that the small village of Willow Way and the immediate area around it was soon after abandoned to nature herself and left to its own devices. It became dilapidated, and an odd sensation of dread and fear soon rose up all around it. The area soon evolved into a place of shadow and darkness, of boogeymen and childhood nightmares. All that is left of Willow Way now is the legend of the witch's willow. If you find yourself in the area, maybe you will wander upon Bessie Martin's cottage, or where it once stood. People say that it is still possible to see a circle of burned, charred ground where she and her baby once lived in their humble little dwelling. Nothing grows there, no bright, colourful wildflowers, no plants or shrubs either, or sounds of beast or bird. The stream was once clear as glass and flowed as free as Bessie Martin's own spirit, is now sluggish, still as the grave it was, dark, oily black and slimy with algae. Sometimes a cry of an infant has been heard around the looming, ancient twisted willow, where an age ago a young, beautiful, carefree girl sat enjoying the warm spring sun, and where a year later she and her baby girl lost their lives in the name of misdirected anger and prejudice. A person needs to take care not to go too close to the slippery bank and the long tangled weeds that straggle up from the murky depth of the stagnant stream to lay listlessly against the bank, in case they miraculously intertwine themselves around curious exploring feet and drag them down beneath the surface of the cursed water. Carnaval de Almas. The October wind chilled them to the bone as they walked hand in hand along the deserted pier. Nobody else seemed to be around, but in the presence of true love, other people do not exist. For the two people who are experiencing it. So, as they made their way down to the far end of the jetty, the fact that the sky was not full of harsh shrieks of seagulls didn't enter their minds. The old neon sign read Carnaval de Almas Although the neon hadn't been lit by the looks of the sign itself for an age. What does that mean? He thought aloud. She merely shrugged and laid her blonde head against his chest. Come, let's go inside. His words were more a plea than command. She nodded, smiling before pausing a moment to give him a sweet, innocent kiss. The rags, which was the flimsy entrance of the exhibit, were grimy and rotting away from mildew. She grimaced as she ducked her head and stepped in as he held the moulded fabric up for his lady love and stepped in after her. Twilight made it difficult for them to see the interior of the archaic pavilion, but soon the milky shine of the moon helped their eyes see the treasures inside. There is nothing here, my love. He spoke with the voice of a disappointed child. Except toys. Look, so many toys, she said, clapping her hands equally childlike. They both looked around the huge gazebo at the very intricate, detailed, ancient-looking toys. They were a moth-eaten, stuffed toy rabbit with one long ear sticking straight up, while the other was bent over and crooked. A Pierrot clown with bright, beautifully precise but chipped paintwork, and an exquisitely handcrafted marionette puppet in the form of a sailor boy, complete with a blue and white sailor's suit and a white sailor's cap. They are beautiful, he gasped, leaning over to touch the puppet's face. They look so sad, so lost, she said, shivering. Suddenly noticing the icy, grave, cold air around them, outside the pavilion, a tall, thin figure in a purple suit and a black velvet-trimmed top hat strolled casually to the entrance of his very unique exhibition. He laughed. The laugh wasn't a pleasant, joyful one. It was a long, raspy, mirthless, empty, cruel, with as much malice as a rattlesnake bite. The soul collector was pleased with himself. His harvest was plentiful in this place. In the pavilion there were 2 new additions to the beautiful, unique and strangely sad exhibits. Amongst the moth-eaten, worn rabbit, the forlorn clown and the wonderfully crafted sailor puppet were 2 perfect, sweet dolls, a boy and a girl, hand in hand. The Pasanta. Whether this story is 100% true or just another old wives' tale made up by aging family members to scare us kids to behave. It had the desired effect because, even being modern, streetwise, urban kids, we always made sure at least one of us shut and locked all the windows, and when we were very young, left a saucer of milk out in the garden to appease the Pasanta and its dark nocturnal motives. For context, my family are Londoners, born and bred, but we have quite a mixed heritage. My gran was born in Waterford, Ireland, but moved with her family to Paddington, London when she was just 18 months old. Granda was what all us grandkids called him, was born to a Spanish London father and mother from Gateshead in the north, in Ladbroke Grove, before it was a wealthy place as it is now. It was a working class area back in the late 20s when Granda was 4. He went to live with his grandmother and aunties back in Gateshead. His youngest auntie, Bella, was only 6 months older than Granda, and it was Bella who told us the story of the Pasanta. By the time I was born, Granda had already passed, but our great Aunt Bella outlived him by 18 years, and I remember as a little child listening to Bella's ghouly stories, as she used to say, and being both terrified and mesmerized by her traditional folklore tales that their Catalan-born father told them. There was a story about a family who was terrorized by the Pasanta, or Pasante. It was set as a common cultural belief at the time. It supposedly happened and was as familiar as an urban legend to the kids then as Slender Man is to the kids today. A giant black hairy dog, or car smelling like sulphur, sneaks into open windows. In the depth of night, it terrorizes and harasses the young and aged of the family, and with the stronger members it sits on their chests, crushing the oxygen from their lungs and will from their limbs. They also are known to give the victims horrendous night terrors, and in general are an omen of misfortune or even death. The story goes, on arriving back from a night away from home, he had slept over at his friend Alex's house. 8-year-old Barnaby observed the family house was eerily quiet and still. The front door was still locked, and when he couldn't get an answer, his mother didn't open the door for him. He climbed through his grandmother's open bedroom window. Young Barnaby happened upon a horrible sight. His beloved grandmother was quivering, gibbering, and insensible in the corner of her own room. Horrified, Barnaby ran out, screaming, "Mama, puppy." He ran into his parents' bedroom and immediately began to scream. Hanging halfway off his parents' bed was the lifeless body of his mother. The pallor of her skin, an awful shade of blue. Her lungs had been crushed. It looked as though an enormous pressure had been applied to her chest. Barnaby looked around in sheer panic at his baby sister's crib. She was there, of course. Little Layla was lying flat on her back, her skin the same colour as their mother's. She had suffocated to death. Like someone or something had just sucked the air right out of her. She was only 18 months. He ran around the house, calling out for his father, but his father was conspicuously absent. Barnaby then just ran to the nearest neighbours to get help. Later on that afternoon, Barnaby's father was found roaming the nearby forest. He was very dazed and confused, and just kept repeating 2 words: La pesante, la pesante. Not managing to find any more suspects for the 2 murders, and not being able to get anything remotely sensible from the only surviving witness to the abominable crimes, the police had no choice but to charge the poor father of the family. Nobody wanted to. He had gone totally insane. Since that afternoon, instead of jail, he was certified as not being mentally culpable for the murders and put into an asylum for the insane, the same asylum that his mother-in-law was committed to. Young Barnaby was made a ward of the Catholic Church and grew up to become a fine, strong man and an even better priest, kind, patient and noble. In time he was able to rebuild his life, and if not, forget, move on from that awful morning when he was 8 years old. Only one thing made him wake up, drenched in sweat, crying out in the dark. He sometimes dreams of his old family's house, and he can see everything as clear as he could that day. But what wakes him up petrified is remembering the foul smell, the unmistakable smell of sulphur. Little Boy Lost. This is a fictional story inspired by tales my mum, aunties and gran told us kids. Modern cautionary tales about playing too close to the water or straying too far from the path into the woods. Andy was 5. He was the youngest of Jean and Morris, Appleby's 3 children and was, as certain people in the neighbourhood like to say, born slow. That wasn't a bother to little Andy because he was the apple of the Appleby's eye, and he knew he was loved by his mum and dad, Donna, who was 8, clucked around him like an old mother hen, and even 10-year-old Charlie was always patient with him. Yes, Andy was a happy, friendly, trusting, and very carefree little boy. His grandmother, Joy, used to worry though. She used to try to talk to her daughter, but Jean just said, "Oh, Mum, stop fussing. I don't let Andy out of my sight. You know that." "But Andrew has no fear, Jeanie. No fear of anything," Joy pleaded, but she didn't persevere with this line of conversation. There was always an invisible wall around her, Jeanie, always a reluctance to talk about anything really heavy against their Andy, as if not talking about anything too heavy would somehow protect and keep him safe from a cruel and harsh world, Joy thought. That day was a beautiful, bright, midsummer's day, and it started like any other day in the Appleby household. After breakfast, Morris took the older 2 children to school before going on to work. Morris was a manager at a car parts manufacturing plant and was popular and well liked in his workplace. The other 2 children kissed their mother and said bye to little Andy, and still bantering and laughing together, they grabbed their school bags and left the house, followed closely by their father, telling them to get a move on, you 2. Morris had already kissed his wife affectionately on the cheek and ruffled his youngest son's hair, telling him, "Be a good boy for Mummy, won't you, Andy?" As Andy wasn't at school full time yet, they were going to have a busy day shopping and visiting Jean's mother, Joy. The morning was very successful. First they went to the town, to the butcher's, greengrocer's, and finally the baker's, before taking 3 of Morris's work suits to the dry cleaners. After all that walking, Andy was a little ratty. His legs were getting tired, and it was very hot, so when his mum told him that they were going to see his granny, Andy was excited. He liked going to see his gran because she had a nice house. There was always good things to eat and drink, and he liked cuddling his gran's dog, Barney. Also, outside his gran's house was a nice big green with swings and a bright blue climbing frame on it. And sometimes, when he was good, his mum took him out to play on the green for 10 minutes. There was also a big wood on the other side of the road, where everyone told him he wasn't allowed to go. His mum and dad told him, his gran told him, and even Charlie and Donna told him, and he always listened to Charlie and Donna because they were very clever and kind. He didn't mind though. He really liked the swings and the bright blue climbing frame. They had to take a short bus journey to get to his grandmother's house. By the time mother and son arrived at Joy's front door, Andy had passed fractiousness and was now downright sullen. Jean felt ratty too. She was hot, bothered, and more than a little frustrated with her son's incessant whining. "Hello, my darlings. Come in." "Oh, Jeanie, you look done in." "Thanks, Ma. Yes, I'm exhausted. This one has been a horror." Jean gestured to Andy, who was now clinging onto her legs and continuously whining that he was hot and tired. "What's wrong with my little man?" "Come to Granny." Joy reached out to pick Andy up. He put his little head on her shoulder and Joy carried him through to the kitchen. Followed by her slightly bedraggled daughter, Joy said over her shoulder, "You'll feel better after a cuppa, Jeanie." Her mother was right too, and by the time Andy pleaded to her to go out with him on the green so he could play on the climbing frame, Jean felt more human. Andy himself felt better too. His granny had helped him wash his hands and face, then had given him some orange squash and a slice of chocolate cake, and now he has energized again and ready for some more physical exercise and play. "Oh, don't fuss, Andy. Let me have my tea in peace. I haven't stopped all morning. The green will still be there in half an hour." Andy pouted in protest. However, his mother's attention had already passed from him and again to the conversation she was having with his grandmother. Andy went to the window and, pressing his nose up against it, saw the other children playing happily on the bright blue climbing frame and swings. It would be alright to go outside by himself for just a little while, wouldn't it? His mum would easily be able to see him through the living room window. He could wave at his mum and Gran. They would be happy that he was a big boy now. Jean and Joy were so engrossed in their earnest conversation that they didn't notice the little boy quietly slip past the coffee table and out of the living room. They were so enthused and busy in discussing the latest family news and intrigues that they didn't hear the front door open then close again. "Right, come on then, let's." "Mum, where's Andy?" Jean felt her stomach churn, and a rush of sheer panic, fear, and absolute dread rose up to her throat and erupted into a scream of anguish. "Andy, Andy, where are you, baby? Please, Andy, please answer Mummy." The two women then tore the house apart, desperately trying to find the little boy, their little Andy. The search was fruitless. While Jean hurried out to the green, stopping various children, asking them, "Have you seen a little boy? He's blonde with blue eyes." The answer was always, "No, sorry." Joy quickly called the police. "Yes, hello. I'm reporting a missing child. Please come quickly. In the weeks that followed, there was an extensive police search of the surrounding local area for little Andy Appleby. There were hundreds of volunteers from the local community, obviously including the boy's father, uncles, and father's friends. The people wanted nothing more than to find the 5-year-old, feeling the profound sadness of the entire Appleby family. Even the local woods opposite his grandmother's house that so fascinated Andy were searched and researched by police dogs, a police helicopter, and even secretly by 10-year-old Charlie Appleby and his friends, in a vague hope of finding anything of the missing boy. But nobody ever saw or heard from little Andy Appleby again. Vanished from God's good earth. Certain people from the neighborhood liked to say. Bonfire Night, the legend of Martin Janus. It was 2 days before Bonfire Night, and the weather forecast for the upcoming week promised a soggy, miserable 5th of November, a total washout, and there were threats from the organisers that the public bonfire and fireworks display would be cancelled due to the bad weather. But, like so much of the time, decisions made by the local council were made late and last minute. Ever since the incident back in the 80s, there was always a kind of unmentioned sense of dread resonating from all the adults over 40 leading up to the 5th of November every year, which was totally lost on the children and young people in the area. Not that the kids weren't aware of the incident, even the babies knew about the gruesome tragedy of the 5th of November 1985, usually via older siblings who, although not even born at that time, relished embellishing and exaggerating the details of the actual facts just to spook their younger brothers and sisters. It's all made up anyway. Nathan and Lucas only said it to freak us out. You know what they're like. Jane looked unconvinced at her cousin as she jammed more straw into the leg of the guy. I know most of it is made up. I'm not completely stupid, you know. She grinned broadly before continuing. Daniela ain't like that, though, and remember what she said about it. Jolin laughed, then considered what his little cousin had just said. Jane was right. Although James' older sister teased them, she wasn't as bad as his 2 older brothers, who were merciless in their torment of any younger relatives. Some of it doesn't even sound real though, Jolan continued, laughing. I mean, who heard of a guy coming to life and hacking people up to get revenge for a kid's death? It sounds like a really bad horror film. You've got it mixed up, as usual. It was the kid's ghost that possessed a guy 'cause he accidentally burnt to death, Jane explained, exacerbated with her cousin. There was a boy, though. He did get trapped in the bonfire. He did burn to death when it was lit. Nobody could hear his screams through all the commotion going on. Jane paused, looking at her cousin and laughing at his face. He had turned a sickly shade of green. All right. Shut up, Jay. That's really rank. Okay, it is true though. My dad was in the same class as the boy, Jane said triumphantly. What was the name of the boy who burnt on the bonfire in the 80s? Uncle Frankie. Frankie swallowed his tea and put the mug down on the table and replied in his usual soft, low and deep voice. It ain't fit talk for the dinner table, Joel. What happened to him knocked this community for 6. Everyone around here knew his family really well. It destroyed his poor parents. Frankie poured another cup of tea for himself, and Terry, Jolan's auntie, came to the table and sat down beside him. Martin Janus. Martin, that was his name, she said, looking slightly nervous at just the sound of the name. He was a bit of a loner, weren't he? Jolan said flippantly. Nah, not at all. On the contrary, he was your dad's, Patrick's, Owen's and my best mate, Frankie said, waving his hand, dismissing Jolan's crass comment. We all used to knock around together, me, Jojo and your mum, Connie. Terry continued her husband's sentence enthusiastically, her eyes growing wide and bright, sparkling at the memory of her youth. Instantly make her look 20 years younger. Were you there when it happened? The night he died? Jolan asked cautiously, this time choosing his words and tone more carefully. Terry looked at her nephew for a few drawn-out minutes before speaking again. We were late, too late. Me, Jojo and Marnie were always late. We were getting ready for the bonfire, and after Marnie had to pick her little brother up, her mum couldn't take him because the baby was sick. Terry looked across at her husband and said, she really moaned about it, didn't she, Frank? Yes, she was narked about it. Owen and your dad Patrick were at the football practice. Me and Connie had to go shopping after school for your gran. We were all going to meet at the air park at 6 that evening. Martin must have gotten there earlier to put the guy in position. He was a right nerd sometimes. Ha 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 ha. Frankie's words trailed off, then gave a sad, forced a little laugh as he remembered their friend. He was wearing my tracky jacket that night too. He borrowed it at school 'cause the temperature had dropped and he didn't want to wear his blazer out of school. It was my favourite too, the maroon one. Frankie coughed and looked away from the table, clearly finding it hard to keep his composure. Terry reached over and took Frankie's hand squeezing it gently. She took a deep breath and continued for him. The police said he must have tripped and fell soon after he placed the guy at the center top of the bonfire. He knocked himself out cold. The bonfire was too high and treacherous for anyone to climb it alone. All those heavy bits of wood and kindling sticking out here, there and everywhere. He should have waited for us to get there. He should have stuck to the plan. Jolan looked at his aunt and uncle with the empathy of a 30-year-old, and there was a somber yet comfortable silence. They found the remains 3 days later, but before that there was a police search for him. We all looked for him too. It was the worst week of our lives, Terry said, breaking the silence and getting up quickly to hide the tears welling up in our eyes. The morning of the 5th of November was cold and damp. The bonfire and firework display was on a knife edge of being cancelled, but by the time Jolan met his older brother Lucas and their cousin James outside their secondary school at 3:45, the day had dried out, if not warmed up, and as they started walking home to Jolan's and Lucas' house, there was a buzz of excitement in the air. "We're home, Mum, Dad," Jolan called out from the hall. Lucas ran upstairs without saying a word. "I'm in the kitchen," his mum called back. Jane went to the kitchen and embraced her aunt warmly. Connie hugged her back, saying, "Hello, you two. How was school?" She was surrounded by 2 pans of beans and a chili, a tray of sausages, and another of baked potatoes on the side. There was a sticky toffee pudding and a tray of cinder toffee. "It was okay, I suppose." Jolan kissed his mum on the cheek. You've been busy," James said, glancing around at all the food. "Yes, I have, so hands off. Till later, yeah?" Connie slapped James' hand playfully away from the cinder toffee. "You and Joel go get changed. We need to meet the others at 5, and you need to get the guy from the shed too. I swear it's moved, Joel," James said, looking perplexed and a little unnerved. Jolan looked at his cousin and laughed playfully. "Don't be stupid, James. It probably just fell on its side, and me dad sat it back up again in a different place. No big deal." James looked at him dubiously, then back at the guy and back at Jolene. "Okay, let's get him to the car." When they arrived at the air park, it was swarming with people, families with excited rosy-cheeked children, young couples huddled together in romantic embraces, and groups of kids shouting and running around boisterously. Jolan and James lugged the guy to the bonfire, which would be lit at exactly 7 o'clock on the dot, and gave it to one of the organisers, then went to find Nathan and Daniela. They found the others with one of the groups of rowdy kids that they all knew from school, and they spent the next hour just walking around the small food and firework stalls where Joanne bought a packet of sparklers and Nathan tried to buy some real fireworks but wasn't old enough, to the amusement of Joanne. At 10 to 7, the four cousins broke away from the rest of the group and made their way back to the designated meeting place where their parents told them to gather. The fireworks display was the same as it always was every year, and Jolan told himself that this year was the last year that he was going to go with the rest of his family. Nathan was almost 16 and he had his mates, so he didn't mind hanging around with the family. But Jolan thought that at 12 the lure of the bright lights and the loud bangs, whirs and whistles of the annual firework display were wearing thin. Joel, our guy's about to go on. Look, watch. Jolan's train of thought was broken by James' excited squeals, and he was snapped back into the present as he watched their pride and joy being placed at the top centre of the huge pyre, and the three organisers were about to light it. Suddenly there was a heavy, strong wind that seemed to come from nowhere. It appeared to only be focused on the immediate vicinity of the bonfire, not really affecting the area beyond the bonfire. Where's Ellie? She was here a minute ago. Ellie, a woman's voice broke the expectant, uneasy silence, and people began to move back and apart, making little motions of movements rippling throughout the crowd of spectators. The attention of the crowd was now redirected from the majestic bonfire to searching for the misplaced child. Glancing around at the adults' faces, Jolan couldn't help but notice and identify the look of sheer panic and anxiety. Suddenly, something caught his eye, just a flash of red amongst the darkness and the gloom of the chilly night. He looked in the direction that he saw the glimmer of colour and took a deep breath, while simultaneously grasping his cousin's shoulder to get her attention quickly. James. It turned out he didn't need to do this, as James had seen it at exactly the same time. They looked at each other. Come on, quick, Jolan whispered hoarsely, grabbing James' hand. She looked at Jolan slightly hesitantly, before shrugging and following him. Jolan didn't want to be right about what he thought he had seen, and the cold, damp hand of fear was already at the bottom of his spine, slowly but surely making its way up his back, resulting in even the simplest actions, like putting one foot in front of the other, an almost impossible task. They ran to the back area of the air park where the organisers stored all the fireworks for the display and the various other apparatus and materials. They ducked under the big notice with the words "Keep out, staff only" in big red letters, and got right to the back of the bonfire. The sounds of the crowd and the fireworks were deafening. This feels really dodgy, Joel. I don't like it. Neither do I. Neither do James. Look. They both looked in the same direction, and the spirit of Martin Janus He was standing there right in front of them, bathed in an eerie, silvery blue glow which illuminated him from head to toe. He didn't look like a ghost, he just looked like a boy around Nathan's age. He wore blue jeans and a maroon hoodie. His face and body weren't burnt or disfigured in any way. On the contrary, his features were fine and handsome, with green eyes and a head of strawberry blonde. He did look incredibly sad. He pointed at the area just beside the edge of the bonfire, where the display area began. Joanne and James looked at each other in bewilderment. "There's nothing there, Joel." James stepped forward gingerly, cocked her ear to the cold night air. "What is it, Jay? What can you hear?" James put her finger to her mouth. "Shush." She gestured to him to come nearer. "I think I heard something over there," she said, pointing in the same direction that the spirit of Martin Janus had. The two cousins ran over to the pile of lumber and firewood. It looked as though it had been disturbed recently, like it had been scattered and strewn over the ground. They both stepped over the timber and listened carefully. They could hear a very faint crying, scuffling sound coming from further back amongst the stacked kindling. Joanne and James started to remove the wood away from the pile. Every now and then Joanne looked over his shoulder to find their ghostly guide still gazing at their efforts, sadly and with earnest concentration. After 5 minutes of rummaging through the wood, a small podgy baby hand appeared, and the crying became clearer and loud. They continued removing the timber, and soon a dirty little face became visible. Joanne threw the wood to the ground, while James reached in and gently pulled a cold and frightened 5-year-old girl out of the piled up firewood. It was the missing girl, Ellie Egan. "What were you doing in there, kid?" Joanne asked the infant kindly. James held the small girl in her arms as Joanne wrapped his jumper around her. "I was looking for Sophie, and I got stuck in the wood. I was crying for Mummy, but the nice boy said he would get someone to help me." The small girl sobbed and wiped her nose on Joanne's jumper. "What nice boy, Ellie?" James asked softly. But they couldn't get much more out of Ellie, so they gave up playing detective and carried the missing girl back to be reunited with her mother. The hour which followed the reunion of Ellie Egan and her family was a whirlwind of emotions. Thanks and praises for the 2 young kids who found the small girl. Both Joanne and James were slightly overwhelmed by the attention, and by 8:30 they just wanted to go home to chill out. On the way home in the car, Joanne's dad, Patrick, turned to his son and niece and asked, "How did you two know where to look for that baby?" "A friend showed us where to look," they said in unison. "Well, I reckon you and your friend saved that baby's life," Connie said proudly, beaming broadly at both Joanne and James. Both the cousins looked out of the window and waved at the figure of the boy in blue jeans and a maroon hoodie. He waved back, then slowly faded away. Well, that's it for tonight. Thank you again, Black Cat. Remember, if you want any stories narrated on the channel, then please submit them to Reddit r/homeofscares and follow me on Twitter at homeofscares. Now, good night, my little hellhounds, and sleep tight.